Coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida, this is GovLove, a podcast about local government, brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, Senior Consultant at Ref Telus and GovLove co-host. We've got a great episode for you today. We're going to be talking environment and sustainability in the Queen City, Cincinnati, Ohio. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. Engaging local government leaders is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government. And if you like this podcast and you want to support us, the best way to do so is to go sign up as a member. Your membership dues help support this podcast. Now, let me introduce today's guest. Oliver Kroner is the director of the Office of Environment and Sustainability for the City of Cincinnati, a position he's been in since July of 2022. Previously, he served as the city's sustainability manager for about 6 years, and he also served as an environmental scientist for Terra. He is also a proud AmeriCorps alum, which I read in his bio on the city's website. With that, Oliver, welcome to GovLove. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Ben. Thrilled to be here.
Cool. So we have a tradition on the podcast to get to know our guests a little better. To do a lightning round. So my first question for you, what book are you currently reading?
I am one of those people who's reading a lot of books all at once, jumping between them. So a book that I just finished is called The Golden Mole. It was a birthday gift from my friend Zoe by Catherine Rundell. It's a treat. Each chapter is devoted to a different species of this planet. Each one is peculiar. And you should read it just for the hermit crab chapter, cool, which speculates as to how Amelia Earhart truly disappeared.
Oh, really? Wow. All right. You piqued my interest. I'll have to add that to the list. Cool. All right. My next line question for you. What was the last movie you saw in theaters or stream?
Well, I have 3 little kids. So we have Disney movies on all the time. So last adult movie I saw was on a plane flying back from Denver. I watched 3 Days of the Condor, the old CIA insider movie.
Yeah,
it's a good one.
Yeah, and on a plane is probably exactly the way they envisioned you watching it.
Yeah, right.
What about the last kids movie? You got any of those standing out as worth seeing?
The new Puss in Boots is pretty good.
Yeah. Cool. Very cool. All right. So my next line of question for you. What was the first album that you bought?
I'm racking my memory. I grew up in a household full of music and there are albums everywhere. I think the first one that I saved up for to buy was Ace of Base. I'm not sure what the name of that album was, but shows you how old I was when I got into music.
Yeah, nice. Very cool. All right, and then my last line of question for you. Where do you go for inspiration?
I think my best answer to that question is the soccer field. Yeah. I have been a big soccer player. It's one of the only places where I can think about nothing but what I'm doing.
Yeah.
However, I am getting to the age where my knees are starting to bark a little bit. So I've been doing more skiing, which offers the same sort of flow state, which is where I find inspiration.
Oh, yeah. No, I like that. Yeah, that flow state. That I do miss that about organized sports. But yeah, the knees. Yeah,
they catch up with you.
Yeah, they do. Cool. So close listeners to the pod will know one of my favorite things to ask is kind of our guest's path to local government. So for you, one of the things that I think it highlights is that there's no one way into this field or into working for cities and municipalities. So for you, what was your path in the local government? How'd you kind of end up working for the city of Cincinnati, and how'd you end up in kind of the role you're in today?
Yeah, so I was planning to study psychology, but I deferred my admission and did a year of AmeriCorps, which you mentioned already, out in New Mexico, working out in the national forests out there. And during that year, I read a lot and thought a lot and sort of landed on the fact that the climate crisis would be the challenge of our lifetime. And so I shifted gears a little bit and studied environmental policy and then went to work for a small NGO called Terra. We were doing the data and analytics behind environmental policy. So if you think of air quality standards and water quality standards, food safety, etc. And then sort of in parallel to that, I came back to Cincinnati from Boston, where I did my school. And I became involved in the community council, my hometown community council. Cincinnati has 52 neighborhoods, and most of them have community councils that sort of act as micro government for the neighborhood. And rose to leadership in the Northside Community Council, where we were starting to find some success in rolling out sustainability programs. Things like neighborhood recycling, and landed some grants from the EPA to focus on LEED for neighborhoods development and equitable and affordable housing programs like that.
Cool.
So it gave me a taste of how change can happen through community organizing and through government. And then a role opened up, the role of sustainability coordinator opened up with the City of Cincinnati. And in many ways, I would say that was always sort of my dream job, but didn't really exist when I was fresh out of undergrad. So applied for it and thankfully landed the role. And it's been a really nice way to weave different interests together, doing something I love. So I've been here now for just over 7 years, actually. And as of last year, stepped into the director role here in the office.
Cool. Very cool. Very cool. There's a lot I want to ask about. So that the work you did for Terra, was that like primarily like research, like academic kind of work, or were you doing work for government, like as a contractor?
Both. We did a fair amount of government work, a fair amount of corporate work, but anywhere where you have potential chemical exposure in your life, that's where Terra was focused.
Interesting. Very cool. Well, and that path into local government is cool, like working in kind of the neighborhood council level. Was there anything in particular that you worked on that you were like, wow, I'd love to be able to do this with the city more often, or was it or I don't know if there's anything you got to work on in that kind of volunteer capacity that was like, man, working for the city or working for local government would be a cool switch? Or
it certainly gave me a taste for how the gears turn within government. And that was intriguing to me. And at the time, part of my time there was through the 2008 housing crisis. And our Northside Community Council, our zip code, was one of the hardest hit in the country by the foreclosures. So it was a really pivotal moment. And coincidentally, at the time, we were doing our neighborhood comprehensive land use plan. And the thinking at the time was we really need to transition to single family zoning to help encourage homeownership and stabilize the community, which is interesting to look back on because it was considered best practice at the time and now runs counter to many of the initiatives we're working on to encourage density and affordability. So you can see the impact of the work in your community, which is really what keeps me committed to it.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. That the how much the kind of best practice or like wisdom of the industry has changed around affordability and in neighborhoods. Yeah, that's really cool.
Could I do a quick aside, Ben?
Yeah,
I actually am recalling now. I listened to one of your podcasts. Our author of Arbitrary Lines.
Yeah.
About zoning reform.
Yeah.
That's one of the books on my bedside right now. So just bring it full circle here.
Yeah. Nolan Gray. He's great.
Nolan Gray, right?
Very cool. And so we can kind of shift into some of your current work. So I think we mentioned at the top, it's the Office of Environment and Sustainability. So just to give our listeners maybe a sense of kind of where you sit within the organization at the city, can you maybe talk about like where the office is and like how big your team is and kind of who you report to and all that kind of good stuff?
Yeah, sure. So we are an office of the city manager. Our office is 11 people strong. And our team is focused on the climate crisis, how it will impact city government and our operations, how it will impact quality of life for the people who live here, how it will impact our economy, and what we're going to do about it. So the day-to-day, what we're going to do about it part is really where we're focused right now. We report to the assistant city manager, Virginia Talent, who reports to the city manager, Cheryl Long. And I'll say that being in the city manager's office gives us the ability to work across city departments and have a high touch frequency with everybody.
Yeah. And we'll have to get into how you work with across departments, because that, since your work touches so many different aspects of the community and the city. So kind of just in prepping for this interview, I was going through your website and saw the Green Cincinnati Plan. So, and I know you guys are going through a big update right now, but maybe for our listeners, how does that Green Cincinnati Plan kind of guide your team's work, and maybe what are some of those focus areas that are part of that plan?
So Green Cincinnati Plan is a community vision for how we will become more sustainable, more equitable, and more resilient with a long-term horizon. So we've been doing this since 2008, which was the first time we ever did a climate action plan as a city. And as the climate science changes and the politics evolve and the technology advances, we have found the need to update the plan on a 5-year cycle to keep our finger on the pulse. So right now, we are preparing what will be the 2023 Green Cincinnati Plan, which will be the fourth climate action plan of the city. And I really emphasize community vision because one of the functions of our office is modeling where our carbon emissions come from. And when we look at city government, we only produce about 3.5% of those emissions. So we really have to look to build community partnerships to address the lion's share of these emissions across the city. Historically, we've had a goal of 80% decarbonization by 2050. And speaking to the evolution of the science, shortly after we published the 2018 Green Cincinnati Plan, the science moved, and it became clear that our goal was insufficient to meet the moment.
Yeah.
And so in 2023, for the first time ever, we will commit to carbon neutrality by 2050 with a near-term 50% reduction by 2030. So that will align us with the current science coming out of IPCC and National Climate Assessment.
Wow. Yes, that's a big change. Well, and so your background's kind of interesting in this, and I've talked with a fair number of folks that do this kind of climate action work in local governments now, and the thing that I'm always curious about is how do you get to measuring some of this, like like the carbon impact of, and like what the city can actually directly control versus what you're needing to partner. And like, since you did a little bit of some of this modeling type work in your previous life, I'm just curious how does your team go about in measuring the current state versus, and then what are the things that'll actually move the needle in order to like meet those future goals?
So that there's a protocol for cities for measuring where our carbon emissions come from. And to put it simply, if you think about anywhere we are burning fossil fuels to power our lives, that's where emissions are coming from. So in Cincinnati, about 1/3 of the fossil fuels we burn is within the transportation sector.
Yeah.
And about 2/3 comes from heating and cooling and powering our buildings. So at a high level, that gives us a pretty good sense of where we need to focus. We also produce a fair amount of methane within our waste stream when organic matter decomposes. But at a high level, that gives us a good sense of where our key priorities lie. Yeah. We know we need to shift to clean, renewable energy, and that is the big lift before us.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So, I mean, that's a good transition into kind of the focus areas of the plan. And I guess you can pick if you want to talk about the update or the current version, because but what are some of those focus areas? So if you know this is the big goal, and you know kind of that a third of it is transportation, 2/3 of the emissions are the built environment. How are you guys kind of approaching? What are some of those focus areas about how you guys are approaching meeting those long-term goals?
Yeah, so in the 2023 plan, we organize into 8 different focus areas. We focus on buildings and energy, city operations, community activation, food systems, mobility and transportation, our natural environment, resilience and climate adaptation, and zero waste. And if you think about it, those are all of the core intersectional systems that impact our environment and our climate. When we get into actions and where we focus, we are making pretty significant headway on our renewable energy work. Cincinnati is under construction on a 100 megawatt solar array.
Wow.
That's approximately 1,000 acres of solar just outside the city of Cincinnati that will power the equivalent of 25,000 homes here. And I will tip my hat to Michael Forrester, who's a predecessor here in our office, who was the architect of that program. But in Ohio, we have interesting energy laws in that you're not allowed to produce and distribute energy.
Huh.
So that gives us the ability to shop for where energy comes from. And on top of that, we have what is called community choice aggregation, where the people here have voted to give city government the ability to bundle all of their energy and purchase on their behalf wholesale. So we are able to purchase large swaths of renewable energy to power the homes in Cincinnati. And so this 100 megawatt solar farm will help feed that community choice aggregation program. So that's one way we can power our city with renewable energy and bring prices down pretty significantly.
Yeah.
But I think one of the big challenges for Cincinnati and beyond is there's a growing recognition that for a long time we've considered natural gas a bridge fuel. But at this point, we really need to focus on electrification. And certainly the car market is driving that forward pretty aggressively. In 2018, we had electric vehicle strategies that we considered fairly aggressive and moonshots, and the market has moved rapidly. But we have to do the same thing in the building sector. And that's a much bigger lift because we're not replacing buildings the way we replace cars. So figuring out how to do this in a way that makes economic sense will be a challenge in Cincinnati and across the country.
Huh. Yeah. That's fascinating. So for the energy piece, do you have to work with because the electric utility in Cincinnati is not the city, right? It's a third party?
Correct. We have an investor-owned utility.
Yeah. So how does that work? I guess so you're purchasing this fascinating. You're purchasing energy from the solar field, but you have this third investor-owned utility that's delivering it to the community, or how, I guess what's their kind of role in all that?
Right. They own the grid. But we can shop for where the electrons or the natural gas comes from.
Oh, okay. Huh. Very cool. That's really cool. So is there anything else in kind of that energy besides the solar work that you guys are working on? Is there anything else in kind of that energy space or around working with the utility or shopping for other renewables that you guys are pursuing?
One of our big challenges is that we have a city with a fairly high poverty rate and a very high rental rate. 60 to 70% of Cincinnatians rent their homes. And with an old building stock like ours, many of those buildings are not energy efficient. And in a typical lease agreement, the tenant takes on the utility bill, but the landlord's charged with any energy efficiency improvements or upgrades. So if you think that through, there's really no economic incentive for the property owner, the landlord, to make energy efficiency improvements.
Yeah.
And over time, we're seeing this get worse and worse in that energy burden, which is our measure of energy poverty, where we take the utility bill as a percentage of household income is growing in a way that is problematic. So we have a number of programs focused on energy efficiency in multifamily buildings. Call this the Warm Up Cincy program, led by my colleague Molly, where if you are a tenant living in energy poverty, you can approach our office and we can help do an audit of your apartment. We can swap out light fixtures and appliances, do some weatherization. And if you complete an energy education program, then we can help pay down your utility bill. And then for property owners, if you rent to someone living below the poverty line, then we will offer up to $5,000 to match your energy efficiency improvements, provided that you commit to holding rent stable for the next 3 years. So we're trying to hit this from both sides. But when we look at our entire building stock, this is a significant lift. We're looking at about 35,000 apartments that are experiencing energy poverty.
Wow. That's how much of that, how big of a percentage is that of like the total like housing stock?
That's of approximately 135,000 housing units.
Yeah. So that's a huge chunk of your population that you're, wow.
Unfortunately, yes, but a clear intersection of climate and equity issues.
Interesting. So is that part of the, I think I read a little bit about, you have some energy equity programs. Is that one of those?
That's our flagship energy equity program. We're doing more and more around electrification and heat pump implementation.
Yeah.
The Inflation Reduction Act has a number of incentives to encourage electrification, and activating our community around those opportunities is one of the big challenges for us right now.
Yeah, no, that that federal legislation, it seems like so overwhelming, but like there's so many opportunities in there. How have you guys like sorted through, like what are the things that you guys can help activate the community around, or the city could take advantage of? Like that just seems like such a big lift to go through that legislation and figure out what all you can do.
In all honesty, it's a pretty crazy moment for urban sustainability workers. I mean, we went from a period where there was very little, if no, federal support for climate action to a place where every time you blink, there's a new email with a new opportunity. And it's tough to stay on top of things. The federal government has been great at outlining at a high level what is to come, but the details have been trickling in. So it's been an all hands on deck situation here within our office, trying to keep tabs on everything that's moving and how we can make the most of it. And I think many people, so if you're a homeowner, there are a whole slew of incentives, everything from heat pumps to insulation to electrifying your home, your cooktop, your hot water heater, etc. You should absolutely take a close look at that. For governments and nonprofit entities, the big lever pull has been that historically we don't pay tax as a government or a nonprofit entity. And many of these programs have been incentivized through tax credits. If we don't pay tax, we can't get those credits. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, restructures those so NGOs, governments are eligible for direct pay in place of the tax credit. So this really changes the way we can finance energy efficiency work, renewable energy work, vehicle electrification work moving forward.
Very cool. That's awesome. Yeah, it is a really exciting time. And that's why it's been fun to talk to folks doing the work like you, because there's so much progress. A lot of cities have been like Cincinnati, been working in this area for for a number of years, but the progress and the amount of programs that are out there now has really ramped up. And so I definitely want to get into some of the other focus areas of the plan and some of the other programs that you guys have. But you mentioned community activation, and you've had to do an update, and so as I was kind of prepping for this, I saw that you guys did a fair amount of community engagement around it. So can you talk about how did you guys engage the community as part of the Green Cincinnati Plan update? How did that input kind of shape the plan?
Yeah, this might be the part of the plan that I'm most proud of. I think this has been our most robust community engagement effort ever. And at a high level, I want to say it's important to recognize that for a long time, we've thought about climate change as a global phenomenon. We've had global data on where the trends might take us, global warming, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as the science matures, we're getting more and more regional data, more and more local data. So all of a sudden, we're at a place where we have data at the block level, in some cases household level, around the way we might anticipate changes driven by the climate crisis.
Oh, wow.
And from that data, we published our first ever climate equity indicators report, which looks at both the way climate crisis will impact us, but then also vulnerability indicators. So socioeconomic factors, demographics, health factors, et cetera. And when we look at those together, we get a much better sense of where we have pockets of our community who will need more help. And this has been a big partnership between local NGOs here in Cincinnati, our collective impact organization called Green Umbrella, and a new emerging group called Groundwork Ohio River Valley, who's really leading the charge on youth workforce development in the green sector, and our University of Cincinnati. So looking at that data set, we were able to zoom in and say, these communities deserve targeted outreach, and their voices need to be at the center of this plan because they will be impacted first and worst in many cases. And so we moved into neighborhood level, community level resilience planning, where we held workshops at the community scale, asking neighbors to talk through the changes they're seeing, hear the vocabulary that they use, the language they use to describe the issues, and then create a map of where they're experiencing pain points in their community. And then alongside that, a map of solutions. So this could be everything from where they're experiencing urban heat islands, where they're experiencing food access challenges, where they notice neighbors would really benefit from a bus stop, but there's nothing close. So you can imagine how that turns into practical, targeted climate solutions at the community level. The idea being the person closest to the problem is most likely closest to the solution. And in order to make sure that these people could participate, we met in the communities. We were able to pay them for their time coming forward, helping shape this, paying them for their expertise in this topic. And I think what is born out of this is the most localized, most community level climate and resilience planning we've ever done.
That's awesome. So I'm just curious, how did the issues folks were seeing on the ground, and then the solutions they came up with, how did they kind of vary across the different neighborhoods in Cincinnati? I mean, obviously broad swaths here because there's lots of neighborhoods, but I'm just curious, how, did you see some patterns as you're kind of talking to different areas of the city?
I will say we saw more similarities than differences, but to tease apart some of the differences, I don't know if you've been to Cincinnati, but we are a very hilly city.
Yeah.
And that topography creates some unique challenges. We're in the Midwest, so we're not seeing forest fires and sea level rise, hurricanes, et cetera. But we are seeing increases in summer temperatures and giant increases in storm intensity. So more and more, we're seeing hyper intensified, hyper localized storm events. And when those land on a hillside, you can imagine what happens.
Yeah.
At first, you have stormwater runoff in a way that can cause flash flooding and overland flooding. But if the hillside becomes saturated, we have landslides.
Mm.
And then underneath the ground, we have one of the country's oldest sewer systems, which was not designed for these storms. It's a combined sewer system. So we have one set of pipes for raw sewage and one set of pipes for stormwater. But when you have too much stormwater, the system's overwhelmed and the two systems merge, creating combined sewer overflows. And this means we have raw sewage spilling out into our public waterways, in some cases into backyards and creekways, and worst case scenario, creating sewer backups into people's homes.
Mm-hmm.
This is happening, on a scale of thousands of homes annually now. Comes at enormous cost to city government to repair these issues. I think it goes without saying that's not money we have set aside in a bank account waiting for emergencies. Takes away from other programs we want to implement. All that is to say, neighborhoods living at the top of the hill have different issues than neighborhoods living at the bottom of the hill. Mm. And that came out loud and clear through the community engagement process. However, everywhere we went, people wanted jobs. I think there's a sense that the economy is transitioning, that there is a lot of federal programming, federal funding coming forward. They can see changes happening and they want to be a part of that. Yeah. And so workforce development is a major theme of the 2023 Green Cincinnati Plan.
Yeah, I think I saw some initiatives or goal areas around kind of that green economy. What are some of the programs that you guys are pursuing to kind of help people connect to those jobs or encourage that sector?
I think there's opportunities in almost every space. So I mentioned Groundwork Ohio. They're doing a lot of green infrastructure training, starting with high school youth, bringing them out, showing them how to do invasive removal, how to do green infrastructure installation, tree planting efforts, etc. I mentioned our electrification efforts. Yeah. Our assessment right now is that we are understaffed as a citywide. Our contracting pool isn't ready for the electrification shift. So training people up, including existing contractors, on these new emerging technologies and how they will work here will be central to making it all happen. But, sometimes I think we miss the opportunities right in front of us. One of the major shifts that have happened since we published our last climate action plan is we've passed a county-wide transit levy that will significantly increase the amount of funds invested in our bus system. So now we are designing our city around what will be an improved bus system. And, if a third of our emissions are coming from transportation, you can make the case that a bus driver is a key green job in this region moving forward. So everywhere you look, lots of opportunity for economic growth. And, I mentioned how climate change is a little bit different here in the Midwest than other parts of the country. Increasingly, we are seeing companies look to the Midwest as their next home because of our relative climate stability and our access to fresh water. You can look at Intel's recent relocation to Ohio. It's approximately $10 billion investment here. Things are changing, and we're trying to be ahead of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, for those kind of things you mentioned, is your office playing like a convening, connecting kind of role? Because I assume you guys aren't going out and doing the training, but are you connecting folks with resources and kind of making sure people are aware of all the things that are out there already in the community, or what's kind of your role within that? Within that space, I guess.
Yeah, I think the honest answer is we're figuring it out.
Yeah.
But we have been successful in landing some of these federal opportunities, and with those have come the ability to hire contractor capacity to do these trainings, to staff up to do these trainings, and pay community members to become involved. So yes, I think we're in many cases the glue of it, trying to pull it all together, acting as a convener. But we found we have to be agile, we have to be nimble in this work, because it can be hard to anticipate exactly how the dominoes will fall.
Yeah. So when you're kind of talking about some of the things you heard in the community, you mentioned, and I don't know that one, I'm not going to get the name of the focus area right, but one of them was around kind of natural systems and kind of your natural infrastructure, for lack of a better word. And you mentioned like tree plantings and invasive species removal. So, I think that work is super interesting, and it's cool to see it tied to climate action work. So can you maybe talk about that focus area and some of the things that you guys are doing around that, for lack of a better word, natural areas?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our natural environment and ecosystem services. I think this is actually one of the areas where we're really strong, but we want to strengthen. Because of our hillside, we have a very high urban tree canopy. Last assessment, I think, put us north of 40%. And we are unique in that we have what we call a street tree assessment. So every property owner pays a small fee to help fund a street tree program. And so our urban forestry department has planted and maintains something close to 85,000 street trees throughout the city, and have done pretty extensive work mapping those, identifying the species type, when maintenance is expected, et cetera. But in doing that more granular assessment of our canopy, came to appreciate that historically we've always had a 40% citywide tree canopy target. But when you look at a neighborhood level, we have some communities that have close to 70% tree canopy and others with less than 5%. And when you look at our urban heat island map, you can imagine the correlation there. The communities without trees are having heat issues. So we've shifted our approach. So now the target for residential communities will be 40%, and then scale down to mixed use and industrial, 25%, in central business district, 10%, hoping that this helps address some of these core resilience issues moving forward. But when we're talking about heat and storms, trees, green infrastructure are our number one solution, right?
Yeah.
They cool our city, they soak up that storm. So we know that we need increased focus in order to adapt to these changes.
Yeah, well, that's a good transition to another area that I wanted to talk about was, and you mentioned adaptation and resilience and green infrastructure. So are there other things besides just the tree plantings, or are there other infrastructure things that you guys are trying to, that you guys are working on, or they're going to be part of the plan? And then are there goals around kind of this resilience and adaptation work for the city?
So, Cincinnati grew up through industrialization, and we have a lot of old industrial scars across our community. And as you might imagine, some of those are clustered in certain parts of the city and certain communities. And when we talk to these communities about their needs, they often feel like these brownfield sites are toxic to the people who live there, toxic to the economy, and holding them back. So there's a push to focus on sort of corridors of these old industrial properties and focus on brownfield remediation. And we've also had some success in this space, securing state and federal dollars to do environmental assessments, and in many cases demolitions of these sites, cleanups of these sites. So that in many ways creates a fresh slate for these communities in terms of new economic activity, new job creation, clearing the way for new infrastructure, green and gray. And one of the major projects over the last decade has been the Lick Run Greenway, which was one of the country's largest green infrastructure projects to date, where an old sewer line was daylighted. So it was one of these situations where there were continued combined sewer overflows. Mm-hmm. This is a giant investment in green infrastructure that now serves as an anchor for a community and future development.
Very cool. So what's that called? We can be sure to link to it so folks can learn more about it.
It's called the Lick Run Greenway.
Lick Run Greenway. Very cool. All right. Well, we'll put a link to that in the show notes, along with a link to your updated plan as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and then I don't know if you'd qualify it as infrastructure, but I mentioned this bus levy. We're actively, as a region, exploring bus rapid transit and improvements to crosstown transit. So this is everything from improving roadways to accommodate bus traffic, improving bus stops to make sure they're sheltered from the storm, improving infrastructure that supports the bus system. And more, we're focused on connected communities.
Yeah.
Finding ways to add density along transit corridors to encourage their use and to ease some of the affordable housing crunch that we're facing along many other cities.
That's very cool. So is that just bringing kind of your weight and like the strategic area of climate action to that conversation around transportation and land use, or how do you guys kind of fit into that? Because obviously, there's probably a planning department and transportation department that's doing the bulk of the coordinating and planning and implementation. But how do you guys kind of like add to that conversation? Or you just how do you add to that conversation, I guess?
You're exactly right. There are so many important voices included in that. We have supported some of that community engagement around exploring concepts of transit-oriented development and connected communities. Even the community level work, identifying community pain points on accessing the bus system. We've been able to help resolve some of those on the ground challenges. But at a high level, I think, in many ways, density is urban climate action, period. Density reduces the environmental footprint of each person who lives in a city. So being a vocal advocate of that fact and reminding people of the climate benefits of this work has largely been our role. But we are close stakeholders in these conversations.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah, that's one of my hobby horses, is that the biggest impact the biggest way local governments can have an impact on the climate and sustainability is through land use and density. And that's really cool that you guys are part of that conversation.
You're exactly right.
Very cool. So one other focus area I wanted to ask you about was I think there's one around city operations. So what are maybe some of the goals and strategies that are part of that work?
Well, certainly important to remember that we are responsible for about 3.5% of our city's emissions, and major components of that are our city facilities and our fleet. We have hundreds of buildings and we have more than 2,000 vehicles. So, as we speak, there's a $9 million energy efficiency overhaul going on in city facilities. We'll add solar to 9 or 10 different buildings. We want to keep that momentum. We want to activate around the Inflation Reduction Act and make the most of it. The vehicle electrification is one of our big logistical challenges right now, because we are pushing for acquisition of electric vehicles, but we don't yet have sufficient charging infrastructure for our own needs. So we're actually closing out 2 requests for proposals right now to help do that needs assessment, help install charging infrastructure across city facilities. That has been one of the near-term challenges in our space. There's so many different actors, so many different needs for vehicles, and certainly nobody wants to move and advance the technology in a way where it doesn't work and sets us back. So we have strong vehicle electrification goals that we're working towards. And then we're sort of actively considering our role in providing public charging. So one of the RFPs will explore placing electric vehicle chargers in our right of way throughout the city to make sure people have access in their neighborhoods, help ease the private market transition, and then also make sure we're avoiding what we're calling charging deserts right now. The idea being that we don't want these all to land in more affluent communities where EV adoption is happening faster. We want to make sure everybody has access to this. And then thinking more and more about our own facilities as resilience hubs in the event of major storm events or grid outages. How can we provide cooling centers in the heat of summer or warming centers in the dead of winter? Our role in providing access to our facilities and renewable energy and grid backup.
Very cool. Yeah, it's fascinating how it's not just buying electric vehicles. There's this whole infrastructure piece to it, and it's a lot more complicated once you get into the details around, the draw on the grid and like when these vehicles will be charging and the volume. So there's a whole lot to implement there.
Absolutely, major grid challenges that will need to resolve. And then I definitely want to also emphasize that we are advocating within this plan for a more participatory budgeting process, bringing community members into process development, program development, and budget development. And maybe you've seen in the federal funding, the Justice 40 initiative, which is a requirement that 40% of those dollars land in communities that need it the most. And we're trying to mirror those priorities across our plan. And central to that will be focusing on procedural equity and bringing people to the table to give shape to these things.
Very cool. Is that I think I saw something like a climate equity budgeting. Is that participatory? That's really cool.
Yeah, it builds toward the systemic change we're trying to create.
Yeah. And is that do you have those neighborhoods or those areas outlined where this is where the 40% needs to go, or is it kind of is it more, or I guess how are you guys defining that? I'm curious.
I think this is one of those areas where the details from the federal government are trickling out, and each agency of the federal government has their own considerations. So it's not the same for every pool of funding or every climate solution.
Yeah.
So we can look to our own climate equity indicators report to give some shape and some sense of what this will look like. But when we look at federal opportunities, federal government is helping shape what that looks like.
Yeah. Okay. So you've mentioned working with across the city and with a lot of different departments. So I'm curious how you, as the director of the office, but also as your office as a whole, how do you guys kind of approach working with other departments in the city? Because kind of a theme throughout our conversation is often you may not be the one directly running something or changing something or putting that new bus lane in the ground, but there are folks in the city that you can work with to make things happen. So how are you guys kind of influencing others, working with others across kind of the city?
This is a difficult question to answer.
Yeah,
Because
it's the hardest part.
one, it's very difficult. Two, it looks different from one initiative to the next.
Mm-hmm.
And three, the nature of this is changing.
Mm.
I think you can sense that our plan is very community focused.
Yeah.
And that we've done a very good job of building relationships with community partners across the city. And in all honesty, I think we have some work to do building relationships internally. And I think you said this, in many ways we have more influence than we have authority in almost all of these spaces. So, relationship building, relationship maintenance, understanding other departments' needs and how we can help support those is the name of the game. But one of the big changes is that we now have a mayor and council who are hyper-focused on climate solutions. And we have a new, young, charismatic city manager, Cheryl Long, and assistant city manager, Sweet, and Virginia Talent and Billy Weber, who are working to help us operationalize these efforts internally. I think the facilities work and the EV work are top of mind in these spaces. But the city manager has done a really good job of opening up communication between departments in a way that hasn't always happened, and relaxing some of those communication channels, making them less formal.
Very cool.
So,
yeah.
And one of the models that has worked well for us is, many of our partner organizations will offer, I call them training cohorts, where they bring together collections of cities working on, you name the strategy. And by bringing those groups together, they can often invite multiple departments forward to talk through issues. And that sort of gives a space to work through challenges, hear what other cities are experiencing, what's working for them, what's not, and developing momentum, for lack of a better term, in these different strategic priority areas.
Yeah. And that makes sense. Well, and I think some of you've also touched on, if I can read between the lines a little bit, some of the connection you're making between the work that departments are already doing and then the overall goals of the climate action plan, like the tree inventory, and then making that connection, for land use, on like how this can have an impact on kind of this overall strategy, so that those departments can see themselves in your work, and they're not just off on their own island too, right?
Well, yes, and celebrating their work.
Yeah.
We have directors and departments doing amazing work in a variety of spaces. I want to feature that and remind them that maybe it doesn't always feel like a climate program to them, but it really has climate implications.
Yeah.
And one thing I should say is that this is the first time ever we've had a city operations focus of the Green Cincinnati Plan. And we did a staff-wide survey to help understand what our 6,000 employees think should be prioritized. And we had multiple meetings of the departments to talk through what emerges as high impact and feasible to accomplish in the next 5 years. So we are doing that relationship building and doing that strategic alignment in the development of this plan. And I hope that we have lots to show for it over the next couple of years.
Very cool. That's awesome. So first the new plan. I know you guys have been, it's still in progress, but there's a draft version out. I think I read that you guys had a meeting with the planning commission recently. So what's kind of the status? When can we look to see the final version and share it and celebrate you widely?
Yeah, I'm impressed you're keeping such careful tabs on this. But yeah, so we've been at this since March of last year. We held more than 42 public meetings. We heard from more than 1,600 residents, received more than 3,000 recommendations for what should be in here. So we've done extensive community engagement, and in many ways, I think that positions us to really leap out of the gate when this plan is adopted by City Council. And I guess I shouldn't take that for granted yet. We present to Council middle of next month,
Cool.
Just in time for Earth Day if it all goes to plan. So because this is such a community-oriented plan, we are building partnerships with community champions. So for each of the actions in the plan, we'll seek a champion organization who will help spearhead making it happen over the next 5 years. And we are working as a team within city government and with some consultants to understand where the federal funding opportunities might really help launch some of these initiatives out of the park right now.
Yeah, no, I really like that feature of your plan is you've got like a community member that's like the chair of the group working on this, featured and quoted, and it really makes it, like you said, feel like it, which it has come from the community. That's awesome. All right, so my last question, it's always the hardest one, but if you could be the GovLove DJ, what song would you pick as the exit music for this episode?
I have a song that I've been having on repeat in my car. It's called Note to Self by Jimmy Stack. I think it'd be a nice outro for a podcast.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, our producer will get that queued up. And with that ends our episode for today. Oliver, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. I really appreciate you sharing the work in Cincinnati and all your expertise and experience.
And Ben, I appreciate you shining a light on government, municipal work.
Yeah. We'll stay tuned, and maybe we can have you back after you guys are down the road of implementing the new plan. For our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders, and the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. You can reach us online at elgl.org/GovLove or on Twitter at the handle @GovLovePodcast. And if you're not already, please subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app and go spread the word. Tell a friend, tell colleagues about this podcast. Help us spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories. And with that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.
Just let it knock you down. Don't fight it, let it bring you back around. Just let it knock you down.